Hello friends, my name is JJ, and I have to say, as an English speaker, I sometimes get a little jealous of other languages. Specifically, I feel like they have way more cool, weird, and obscure linguistic traditions than English does. For example, at the moment, I'm quite obsessed with how Korean sometimes uses Chinese characters, but only in like extremely limited contexts that most Korean people barely have the patience to explain because this aspect of their language is so rare and particular. A few months ago, I made a video attempting to document some of the more obscure aspects of the English language, some rules and traditions that are known to native speakers but are rarely taught in even the most advanced ESL classes, just because the complexity of explaining them greatly exceeds their day-to-day usefulness. One example I gave was the concept of the royal we, or this idea of a stereotypical king using the collective pronouns we and are instead of I and me. This is of basically no relevance for day-to-day communicative English, but it is a cultural reference to a tradition from medieval English that you might see referenced in English pop culture now and then. Anyway, in the comments to that video, you guys gave me a lot of great examples of other obscure or marginal aspects of the English language that the real pros know, but are unlikely to be found in any textbook. So let us now run through a few more examples of super-duper advanced English concepts. This one was probably the most popular thing that you guys brought up. So, as we know, one of the distinguishing grammatical characteristics of English relative to other languages is that English does not use gendered articles or pronouns for inanimate objects. The pencil or the notebook or whatever are not considered masculine or feminine. The exception to this, however, is the very small number of objects and concepts that English speakers have historically referred to using feminine pronouns. This most famously includes boats, certain other large vehicles, some forms of heavy artillery, countries, the concept of a church, especially the Catholic Church when speaking of it as a spiritual institution, and sometimes certain abstract concepts like destiny, justice, or nature. It's in no sense grammatically incorrect to use the its pronouns to refer to these things. Using feminine pronouns to refer to them has just been a cultural custom historically. But in these more woke times of ours, it is also a custom that has become increasingly unfashionable because of the rather patronizing implication that certain things that have been traditionally associated with being deeply loved or protected by men must have inherently feminine qualities. This is the sort of controversy that can only arise in the context of a non-gendered language culture. Because of course, every time you do use gendered pronouns, you are then making an explicit assumption about why that thing deserves to have a gender when most things do not. I remember I had a high school history teacher who insisted on always using feminine pronouns when talking about countries. You know, like Russia expanded her empire. But when I carried this over to college, I got called out by a female professor who told me not to do it because it was old-fashioned and sexist. And to be fair, I think when people gender things in English these days, it does often come off as a bit of a cringy affectation, like you're really trying hard to LARP as someone who's very traditional and old school. I remember there's a scene in The Simpsons where Mr. Burns refers to the concept of nature with feminine pronouns, and that always stood out to me as like a fun little nod from the writers to how old-timey he is.
Nature started the fight for survival, and now she wants to quit because she's losing. Well, I say hard cheese.
But nature's not our enemy.
Well, surely you agree we can do without her?
No, I don't agree.
Another example I often think about is an interview that Margaret Thatcher did with David Frost. She is asked about the sinking of an Argentine ship during the Falkland Islands War. And it's interesting because during the course of the conversation, she flip-flops between describing the ship with gender-neutral pronouns and feminine ones. So even a hyper-traditionalist like Thatcher can't keep it straight.
When he announced it had been torpedoed, he said, and for very good security reasons, that it had been seen earlier that day, and it was torpedoed that day, and that she changed direction, and after, I cannot remember the time she changed direction, I know the time we gave permission for her to be torpedoed.
And I think this is a good illustration of how, independent of anything else, casually using gendered pronouns to refer to inanimate things in English can be quite difficult just because it feels so unnatural. It and its come unconsciously, while saying she and her requires deliberate effort. And for what? Tradition? English is a very unsentimental language, so appeals to this kind of thing don't tend to get you too far. And talking of sentimentality, similar to a lack of grammatical gender, English is also notable relative to other languages for its lack of respectful or formal grammar that you were supposed to switch to when speaking to someone above you in social status. At best, we've got sir and madam, and that's about it. Even though England is famous for having a rigid class system, this is not really reflected in the English language itself, which is a good illustration of how the structure of a language does not necessarily correlate with the character of a culture. But that said, the English did somewhat work around this by dreaming up lots of honorific titles that you're supposed to use in the place of somebody's name when you're speaking to someone who holds some office of importance. The most famous of these is calling royal people Your Majesty or Your Highness, or, in a context that more normal people might encounter, calling a judge Your Honor. I remember there was a joke about this in an old episode of Rugrats, where Angelica kept calling a judge Your Majesty.
Your Highness, I'd like to dismiss my lawyer for gross incontinence.
You don't have to. I'd rather quit than represent a little brat like you.
Your Majesty, if it pleases the corpse, I'd like to act as my own lawyer.
That's just the kind of cute mistake that a kid would make. But it also illustrates how Your Majesty and Your Honor are like the only two honorifics that most English speakers will ever know. But there do exist many other, more obscure honorifics as well, intended mostly for members of the aristocracy or the clergy, including Your Grace, Your Eminence, Your Worship, and Your Excellency. And of course, the Pope is Your Holiness. On some level, learning all of the precise uses of all of these titles makes about as much sense as learning the names of all of the collective nouns for groups of animals that I mentioned in the last video. I mean, I'm probably more literate in political type things than most people, and even I can barely tell you what makes someone Your Grace versus Your Eminence. I do know that Your Excellency is often used for very high-ranking civilian political leaders in the English system. A colonial governor in the British Empire or a governor general in the Commonwealth is called Your Excellency, for instance. An even more subtle rule of English honorifics is that when you're referring to people by these titles on a repeated basis, it is considered proper to stop saying your every time. So eventually you get to the point where you're just like, yes, Majesty, or yes, Excellency. On a similar note, we should probably talk about the arbitrary way that the English language tends to believe it is proper to use the prefix Mr. or Madam when referring to somebody by a government title. So like Mr. Secretary for a cabinet secretary in the United States is common, but senators are usually just called senator. I have heard people try to come up with rationalizations for this, like the idea that the names of some jobs are more like titles than others, so adding Mr. or Madam feels redundant. But I don't think there's really any grammatical logic governing this beyond that it is just sometimes tradition to say Mr. or Madam, and sometimes it's not. I have noticed that some people seem to believe that deliberately not saying Mr. or Madam before a title reflects some level of intimacy with that person. For example, a former Speaker of the US House of Representatives, John Boehner, recently shared this anecdote of his meeting with the late Pope Francis, where he has Francis saying, "Speaker, will you pray for me?" Which sounds very familiar because people almost always call the Speaker Mr. Speaker. I saw a video clip the other day that shows that Attorney General Pam Bondi talks this way to President Trump, which really struck me as a kind of overly familiar way to address the President of the United States.
Pam, would you answer that question?
Sure, President. First and foremost, he was illegally in our country. The Supreme Court ruled, President, that if, as El Salvador wants to
Another fun example of this sort of thing would be when men call a woman milady, which is now widely stereotyped as like this super cringe incel sort of thing to say.
Milady, perhaps I could suggest joining my Rust server instead.
But it is based on the traditional English honorific of calling a high-ranking woman my lady, just as you would call a high-ranking man my lord, calling a high-ranking man master, like Master William, would be an example of this sort of thing as well. Unless you're a member of Britain's fast-fading aristocracy, I feel like you basically only ever see this lord, lady, master form of address used in pop culture these days. Though I do know that in some high-ranking British courts, lawyers still say my lord and my lady when addressing judges. And when you say these two-word phrases often enough, they tend to kind of slur into one. And this is where we get the idea of milady and milord, or even milord as like unique honorifics.
You're in the dock, my lad.
I'm a judge, my lad.
So am I, my lad.
Previously only ever really used in this one very particular contemporary context, but the neckbeards are helping with that. All right, now let us talk about Latin. This is probably the closest English equivalent to the Koreans still sometimes using Chinese. Britain was conquered by the Roman Empire in the 1st century AD, and then freed from a Roman rule in the year 1410. And yet, Latin remained the preferred language of British officialdom until well into the 1700s. As a result, Latin still holds a somewhat revered elite status in the English-speaking world to this day. I don't know if this is that common anymore, but as a child, I actually took Latin lessons at my fancy private elementary school. This was framed as an important way to learn about the ancient origins of many common English words, which of course often have roots in Latin. But beyond that, full-fledged Latin words and phrases still have some presence in modern-day English society, mostly in extremely formal or pretentious contexts. In particular, Latin words and phrases remain widely used in American and British law, and there are a bunch of common legal Latin phrases of this sort that any person who is fully fluent in English is expected to know the meaning of, including habeas corpus, mens rea, prima facie, and pro bono. Some of these legal phrases have migrated into normal everyday English as well. For example, there is a popular song called Bonafide Hustler, with bonafide being a Latin phrase meaning genuine that is now widely used in all sorts of contexts. Sometimes it can actually be pretty hard to say when a Latin word has been formally assimilated into English as opposed to being an identifiably exotic foreign word. Vice versa, status quo, per se, and even the humble etc. are all technically untranslated Latin phrases that English speakers nevertheless consider perfectly normal to sprinkle into everyday conversation. Maybe the distinguishing characteristic as to whether or not they have fully crossed the line over into becoming English words is whether we still are using the Latin pronunciation to say them. So you could say that bona fide is an English phrase, but carpe diem would not be. Latin also remains very present in English-speaking culture in the form of official mottos of things, usually things that are either very old or want to project a certain sense of historic grandeur. Most governments in Britain and America have issued some sort of official Latin motto for the lands that they rule. Here in British Columbia, for instance, we have Splendor Sin Ocasu, which means something like brilliance never setting, hence the flag. Universities are quite fond of Latin mottos as well. Harvard has a famously short one, Veritas, or truth. It's rarer to see this sort of thing in the corporate sector, but there are some. A few weeks ago, for instance, I talked about the famous MGM logo with Leo the lion. Surrounding Leo is a ring that reads Ars Gratia Artis, or art for the sake of art. I feel like most educated English speakers have a rudimentary knowledge of a handful of Latin nouns and verbs, and can maybe understand the meaning of some simple sentences through some rough understanding of root words and context cues. For example, I just made up a Latin motto for this channel, Semper Pax Maxima Nullis Mortis. I feel like most super fluent English speakers could probably get the gist of that one, just because those are Latin words that you tend to see used a lot in various contexts in English culture. Some people in the comments will inevitably correct my Latin grammar, which just shows what an elite and educated audience I have. Okay, so speaking of comments, in my last video on this topic, my friend Jay Blossom had a clever and obscure example of a high-level English concept, the Vocative O. This is the practice of writing the exclamation O with a single O instead of OH like is normally done. Doing this gives the O a sort of old-fashioned energy And Jay notes that this is because the vocative O is often seen in the King James Version of the Bible, which, as I noted in the previous video, is one of the main sources for what people today think that old-fashioned English was like. The movie Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Uses the vocative O in its title to capture this sort of King Jamesy vibe. You often see the vocative O used in songs that are written in a sort of deliberately old-fashioned, sort of vaguely biblical-sounding way. So like the Christmas carol, O Come All Ye Faithful, or the national anthem of my beloved country, O Canada. The opening line of the American national anthem, Oh Say Can You See by the Dawn's Early Light, was originally written using the vocative O. But I notice that these days a lot of people will just write it OH because that's more familiar. I feel like most editors would say that in the vast majority of situations you should always write the exclamation O as OH, unless you're going for like a very specific stylistic effect in like a poem or something. My friend Wooden Potato, meanwhile, called attention to the distinctive cadence of what we could call newspaper headline English. So there was once a British politician named Michael Foot, and he was appointed director of an organization involved with limiting the spread of weapons of mass destruction. And there was a famous joke that the headline in the newspapers the next day read, Foot, Heads, Arms, Body. And that's funny as a play on the double meaning of all of the words, but the joke also requires knowledge of the ways in which headline writing in English usually involves cutting out a bunch of verbs and articles and conjunctions, and even mixing tenses in order to save physical space. So Michael Leeds' weapons group would not be considered correct English in normal contexts, particularly in the context of describing the past tense event of Michael being appointed to lead. You would instead ideally say something like, Michael has been appointed to lead the weapons group. But that's pretty wordy, and our historic sympathy for the space restraints of newspaper editors has conditioned us to accept that headlines will communicate in just a slightly more caveman style of English. A funny satirical example I always liked was from this old Onion article where they have a headline that reads, Area homosexual saves 4 from fire. Man is hero. Gay. That practice of adding a second adjective with a comma is a very common newspaper headline trick that you would never use in any other form of English. Like you wouldn't say, escapee is armed, dangerous, in spoken English, but in a headline, we understand that sometimes you have to cut out the thes and ands, which then gives newspaper headline English this distinctive rhythm, almost a sort of dialect that jokesters like The Onion can have a lot of fun with. All right, and lastly, we got a really weird one, and a good example of a very esoteric part of English that would be pretty pointless to teach in any formal context. Sometimes, mostly in the media, someone will pronounce the letter R in this very theatrical way by rolling their tongue. In pop culture, I feel like this is mostly done as a way of signaling that a character is very snobby and pretentious. It tends to come up a lot in musical theater because it's a very fun way for a sort of hammy actor to over-deliver a line.
Joseph, I'll see you rot in jail.
The Baron and Baroness de Tanar wish to pay their respects to the groom.
Robotnik in the old Sonic the Hedgehog cartoons speaks this way as well, which is again sort of a way to play up his pomposity.
I fear your beamish bow will not even make one bite for my robo-ray.
Only very rarely have I ever seen the rolling R in other contexts. The other day I heard a song called Could Have Been Me by the band The Struts, where the singer does it. And of course, some Canadians will be familiar with the Tim Hortons Roll Up the Rim to Win contest, where their ads made a big show of using the rolling R just to be silly.
Yes, it's time to roll up the rim to win.
So what is this exactly? Well, if you would believe it, it's actually another inheritance from Latin. Back in Roman times, Latin had a lot of words pronounced with rolling Rs. This lives on more prominently in other languages with Latin influences, particularly Spanish, where rolling R's are extremely common and not considered particularly interesting. But knowing Latin's pretentious reputation in English culture, this is presumably why we have come to associate rolling R's with being snobby. It represents an affected desire to enunciate in a very proper way. And I guess the more proper you get, the more your English starts to regress back in the direction of something resembling classical Latin. So anyway, once again, I would be curious to know if any of you guys have any other examples of weird or obscure English things, particularly if you yourself are an ESL person. And if you do speak another language, I would be curious to know if there is any aspects of your language that you would identify as being extremely obscure or archaic or somewhat pointless for foreigners to learn. I've been thinking about making a video exploring the sort of broader topic of cultural anachronisms, so maybe you guys can give me some ideas. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Do not forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you next week.